Yesterday's ruling, Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister should have done the honourable thing and resigned. Yet, Mr. Speaker, here he is, forced back to this House to rightfully face the scrutiny he tried to avoid. With no shred of remorse or humility and, of course, no substance whatsoever.
That's right.
So let's see if he will answer some questions.
He won't. He won't.
Does the Prime Minister agree with his Attorney General
Write it down, Boris.
that the government got it wrong, or with the Leader of the House that the Supreme Court committed a constitutional coup? This, Mr. Speaker, is a vital question about whether the government respects the judiciary or not. The Attorney General was also categorical that the government would comply with the EU Withdrawal No. 2 Act. Can the Prime Minister confirm that? Mr. Speaker, I want to pay tribute to those MPs from all parties across the House, the Lords and in the Scottish Parliament and the Welsh Assembly, who have not only fought so hard to stop a disastrous no deal, but continued to take the case against prorogation through the courts. The government has failed to silence our democracy. Mr. Speaker, during the period of unlawful prorogation, the government was forced to release their Yellowhammer no-deal analysis and plans. No wonder the Prime Minister has been so eager to avoid scrutiny and so eager to hide the dangers of his Brexit plan. The release of those documents leads to many questions the government must now answer that our Parliament is back in operation. So I would like to start by asking the Prime Minister why Mr. Speaker, by asking the Prime Minister why the government described leaked Yellowhammer documents in August as being out of date. When the documents were later produced in September, they were word for word the same documents. It is clear they have tried to hide from the people the truth, the real truth of a no-deal Brexit, and tried to hide the fact that their policy would heap misery on the people of this country. Let's just take a look at the analysis. Chaos at Britain's ports with months of disruption. People going short of fuel and fresh foods.
Your paper?
It's your paper, you wrote it, you tried to hide it. I beg your pardon, Mr. Speaker, I don't hold you responsible for writing the document. Disruption of people's vital medical supplies. Rises in energy prices for every household in the whole country. A hard border for the people of Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. Most damning of all, Mr. Speaker, is the passage that simply says, and I quote, low-income groups will be disproportionately affected. Well, there we have it, Mr. Speaker. A simple warning, a simple truth, that a Tory government is continuing to follow a policy they will know will hit the poorest people in our country the hardest. They simply do not care. Mr. Speaker, the damning document we have already seen is only 6 pages long. It's only right that this House should expect more transparency from this government. The government says they're doing all they can to get a deal before October the 31st. But the truth, Mr. Speaker, is the Prime Minister has hardly put any effort into negotiations, any progress at all, looks at its most generous best to be minimal. Only yesterday, the European Union's chief negotiator, Michel Barnier, said that there was no reason today for optimism. Can I ask the Prime Minister why he believes Mr. Barnier has that view? This House is still yet to hear any detail of any deal the government seeks to negotiate. We are told the government has distributed papers to Brussels outlining proposals for a change to the backstop. Will the Prime Minister publish these papers and allow them to be debated in this House of Parliament? For this government to have any credibility with our people, they need to show they have an actual plan. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister also has questions to answer about his conduct in public office. And in particular, allegations that he failed to declare an interest in the allocation of public money to a close friend whilst he was Mayor of London. It was announced today that the Department of Culture, Media and Sport is reviewing the funds allocated in the light of the Sunday Times report. Did the Prime Minister initiate that review? Will the Prime Minister fully cooperate with the DCMS review and that of the Greater London Assembly? Will he refer himself to the Cabinet Secretary for investigation? Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister, no Prime Minister, is not above the law. Mr. Speaker, no one can trust this Prime Minister. Not on Iran, not on Thomas Cook, not on climate change, not on Brexit.
On Iran, yes, on Iran.
For the good of this country, Mr. Speaker,
Order. The Leader of the Opposition is entitled to be heard in this Parliament. Order. And he will be heard. I don't mind how long it takes. These exchanges will take place in an orderly manner. Be in no doubt about that. Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Quite simply, for the good of this country, he should go. Mr. Speaker, he says he wants a general election. I want a general election. It's very simple. If you want an election, if he wants an election, get an extension and let's have an election.
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the right honourable gentleman asked several questions. I'll try and deal with them in order. On the first point, my friend the Attorney General made absolutely clear, of course, that this is a judgment with which he disagreed. Of course, we respect the judgment of the Supreme Court. On the second point, are we about the Ben Burt Act? I will say what I'm sure he understands. We will, of course, obey the law, and we will come out of the EU on October the 31st. On his point about preparations for a no-deal Brexit, I congratulate my right honourable friend, the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, who just spoke for 2 hours on this matter. Our preparations are very far advanced, and I think this country can be entirely confident that we will be ready, deal or no deal. On his point about whether we are on the verge of getting a deal or not, well, it is absolutely true that negotiations are difficult, but we are making progress. And all I will say to him and to his friends is that they have not been made easier by the Surrender Act that he passed. And I am very proud, by the way, to take his next point, about everything that I did as Mayor of London. I may say to the current Mayor that he'd be better off spending less on press officers and more on police officers in London, because we were funding 20,000 more on our streets. And as for being trusted on Iran, Mr. Speaker, this is a man who took the shilling of the mullahs from Press TV. Mr. Speaker, I think there's something. I was rather sad, actually, in a way, that the Labour conference was interrupted by the ruling, because I was awestruck by some of the things I heard, doubtless designed to obscure the inanity of his policy over Brexit. He wants to abolish fee-paying schools at a cost of £7 billion to the taxpayer. He wants a 4-day working week, cutting the incomes of the lowest paid in this country. He wants to abolish Ofsted, and now we hear he wants to abolish all immigration controls from the EU. But there was a crucial passage missing from his speech, it turns out, Mr. Speaker. I think there's something slightly pitiful, in a way, about the right honourable gentleman. It seems that he actually did want to call an election now, Mr. Speaker. There was a passage in his speech calling for an election now, but it was censored by the Stasi in the form of the Shadow Chancellor. Or possibly it was the Shadow Lord Chancellor. Mr. Speaker, the right honourable gentleman is being gagged. He's being muzzled. He's being held captive by his colleagues. They won't let him say what he wants to say. I say, free the Islington One, Mr. Speaker. And why won't they allow him to have an election, Mr. Speaker? Why won't they allow him to unleash his charms on the electorate? It's because they're not only terrified that he's going to lose, but also even more terrified by the remote possibility that he might win. He can't control his own party. He can't decide whether he's for Leave or for Remain. He's being held captive by his colleagues. The electorate are being held captive by this zombie parliament and this zombie opposition, and he wants the entire country to be held captive in the EU after October the 31st at a cost of more than £1 billion a month. We say no. I say no. Let's get Brexit done and let's take this country forward.
Mr. Speaker, can I congratulate my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister? Order! Order!
Order! Order! Order! I appeal to members of the House to calm themselves. I've just called the right honourable gentleman, the member for Chingford and Woodford Green. He is entitled to put his question, and the rest of us are entitled to hear him. Mr. Ian Duncan Smith.
Mr. Speaker, can I congratulate my right honourable friend on his very good put down of the shallow leader of the opposition. Can I also say that I understand now that his government has changed the root origin of the term Yellowhammer to describe the botched attempt by the leader of the opposition to dispatch his own deputy. And could I ask him, I received and saw in my constituency, as others did recently, leaflets from the Labour Party calling for a general election now. Could he answer me this question? Can he give me any reason why we are not having an election at this particular point? Does he think for any moment it could be because the leader of the opposition fears his own party just as much as he fears us?
Prime Minister.
I thank my right honourable friend for his very acute question, Mr. Speaker, and I'm afraid the answer is very simple, that they don't want an election because they are not sure that the public would trust them with the government of this country, and I think that they're right, and I think that they put the yellow into Yellowhammer, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank the Prime Minister for advance copy of his statement? I have to say, when I read the first paragraph, and it talks about the Supreme Court verdict, Mr. Speaker, it wasn't the Supreme Court verdict, it was the judgment of the Supreme Court. Yeah. And perhaps the Prime Minister might start to show some respect for the judiciary. You know, we're here today because the Prime Minister was utterly humiliated by the Supreme Court by a count of 11-0. And you might have thought in that diatribe that we had that we might have had some humility, that we might have been able to acknowledge that what we've had is the unlawful shutting down of Parliament. Mr. Speaker, sorry is indeed the hardest word for the Prime Minister. You know, it was said by a former Prime Minister, where law ends, tyranny begins. And Mr. Speaker, while it pains me to say it, the fact the Prime Minister is still standing here today, he in fact does believe he is above the law. Well, Mr. Speaker, he is not. And thank heavens for the action that was brought in the courts in Scotland and England. And I want to pay tribute to my honourable friend for Edinburgh South West. And thank goodness the courts have done their job and made sure that parliamentarians are back where they should be, in this House, holding the government to court. The ruling of the Supreme Court has made it absolutely crystal clear. The actions of this government, this Prime Minister, led to the unlawful prorogation of Parliament. Delivering the verdict, Lady Hale stated that prorogation was null and void. Have you no shame, Prime Minister? Mr. Speaker, the court concluded that the decision was unlawful because it had the effect of frustrating or preventing the ability of Parliament to carry out its constitutional functions without reasonable justification. Mr. Speaker, without reasonable justification. And the Prime Minister talks about us running off to the courts. Well, we got the courts to do what he failed to do, which was to respect parliamentary sovereignty. Frustrating, preventing Parliament carrying out its constitutional duties without reasonable justification. How devastating for a Prime Minister to have such a judgment. Where law ends, tyranny begins. Yet the Prime Minister said he didn't agree with the courts. He only agrees with his cronies in Number 10, his Brexit-obsessed fan club. He cannot pick and choose when it comes to the law. He must obey the law. That is not leadership. He quite simply is not fit for office. And, Mr. Speaker, when I hear of the Prime Minister talking about a Surrender Act, how despicable that he refers to members of this House that are doing their duty to protect our constituents, and he uses language such as surrender. It is language which is not suitable from the Prime Minister of any country. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister's position is no longer tenable. His failure to resign is an embarrassment. People have had enough of this shambles. Mr. Speaker, we have reached a difficult and dangerous point. Not just in...
The right honourable gentleman leads the third party in this House. He has a right to be heard. He will continue his contribution, and he will be heard however long it takes. If the message has to be repeated again and again and again ad infinitum, so be it. He will be heard. End of subject. Ian Blackford.
I am much obliged, Mr. Speaker. We have reached a difficult and dangerous point, not just in relation to the Brexit crisis, but for the constitutional future of these islands and indeed the future of our democracy. We have a Prime Minister standing here in Parliament that he sought to silence. People across these countries will be reading today about how the Prime Minister fought the law, but the law won. The Prime Minister, the head of government, who is responsible for the law, responsible for governance. What an example to the public. Let me be clear to the Prime Minister that he should resign. But if he fails to do so, yes, the opposition must unite to trigger a vote of no confidence to bring this chaotic government down. By triggering a vote of no confidence, we will ensure that the Benn Act is honoured, to take no deal off the table, by allowing the opposition to instil an interim leader to take back control and to protect our economy from the cliff edge. Mr. Speaker, the Scottish National Party fully supports stopping no deal. It is our priority. But let me be clear to members on these benches, we are not powerless. Doing nothing is not an option. This is the time for leadership. Once we have removed the Prime Minister, removed the threat of no deal, the people must have their say through a general election as quickly as is possible. We must unstick this mess, and we must trust the people to make their choice. We cannot trust this Prime Minister. His time must be up. His days of lying, of cheating and of undermining the rule of law must be numbered. So I only...
Order. Just for the avoidance of doubt, I'm sure the right honourable gentleman will not state in this House that the Prime Minister has lied in the House. He must not do so. Order. That is the order. That is the procedural position. He didn't say that, but he did refer to lying, and I know he cannot be referring to it in the context of the exchanges in this House. And a nod of the head to confirm that my interpretation is correct will suffice, and he can then proceed with the rest of his questioning. I'm correct in my surmise, I'm sure.
Indeed, Mr. Speaker. So I have one question to the Prime Minister for now. Do the right thing and do it now. Prime Minister, end this dictatorship. Will you now resign?
The Prime Minister!
Mr. Speaker, I thank the right honourable gentleman, and of course on his substantive point, we do respect the Supreme Court, Mr. Speaker, and the reason that I want a Queen's speech and wanted a Queen's speech is quite frankly, of course, because we have to do what we can as a united kingdom to remedy the waste and incompetence of the high-taxing, fish-abandoning government of the SNP in Scotland. And that's why we are investing in 20,000 more police officers and 20 new hospital upgrades and levelling up education funding and funding gigabit broadband across the country. And I hope, Mr. Speaker, and I bet the people of Scotland hope, that in spite of all the uselessness of the government of Scotland, that those benefits will be passed on to the people. because that is the only obstacle in our way.
Sir William Cash.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Supreme Court, Mr. Speaker, mentioned that the prorogation had...
Order. I apologise for interrupting the honourable gentleman, but he too... Order. The honourable gentleman must be heard. I want to hear his question and the answer to it. Sir William Cash.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The Supreme Court mentioned that the prorogation had an extreme effect upon the fundamentals of our democracy. Does my right honourable friend accept that it is more than an extreme and undemocratic effect for Parliament itself to tear up its own Standing Order 14, because the priority that Standing Order gives to government business as compared to private members' business, such as the Surrender Act, derives exclusively from the fundamental democracy of the voters of this country in general elections, and to remedy this, they must be given an early general election to decide who governs this country.
Prime Minister.
My right honourable friend, and he is of course quite right in the sense that the people of this country can see all kinds of forces in this country going to quite extraordinary lengths, whether judicial or parliamentarian, to prevent Brexit from being delivered on October the 31st. But I have to tell my honourable friend, and I'm sure he will agree with me, we are not going to be deterred by such ruses, and we are going to get it done.
Jay Swinson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister is not serious. He needs to understand that actions have consequences. Even my 5-year-old knows that if you do something wrong, you have to say sorry. If my son can apologise for kicking a football indoors, surely the Prime Minister can have the humility to say sorry for misleading the Queen, misleading the country, and illegally shutting down our democracy.
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I think quite frankly, one of the actions for which the Right Honourable Lady might wish to take responsibility was writing to the President of the European Commission, actively encouraging him not to do a deal with this country.
Sir Patrick McLaughlin.
As somebody who voted Remain in the referendum, I'm mindful of the fact that this House of Commons voted 6-1 in favour of having a referendum. On 2 occasions, the Prime Minister has attempted to call the general election, which would have taken place on the 15th of October. If the British people, where we get our mandate from, had decided there should have been another Prime Minister for that occasion, they would have had the opportunity. Why was that stopped?
Prime Minister.
My right honourable friend who speaks with great wisdom and with great experience of this place, but I cannot believe in all his time here he has ever seen a leader of the opposition actively forego and turn down, in full view of the British public, the opportunity to have a general election. But that is what has happened twice, and there can only be one possible explanation: that he doesn't think he can win.
Mr. Nigel Dodds.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There will be many people, not least the families of senior judges, who were murdered in Northern Ireland, many of them, including the Lord Justice of Appeal, who will wish that the Leader of the Opposition, when he supported a terrorist organisation that murdered judges, had really put those words into action much, much earlier in his career. When we talk about respect for the rule of law, it should have been respect for the rule of law through the decades of the Troubles in Northern Ireland as well. On Brexit, Mr. Speaker, the reality is that despite everything, the fundamentals remain unchanged, that we need to deliver on the Brexit referendum, but that we must do so ideally and, if possible, with a deal, and we want to get that deal through this House. So would he agree that the way to do that is to deal with the anti-democratic backstop, the trap that he talks about, the issue of consent? We will work with him on those issues. But that all the shenanigans in this House undermining the leverage of the Prime Minister is actually in danger of bringing about the very result that some who say they don't want a no deal will actually achieve.
Prime Minister.
I thank the right honourable gentleman for what he has just said, and of course I agree with him profoundly in his condemnation of terrorism. I make no comment on the support of the right honourable gentleman opposite for those organisations, because I've made that point many times before. But on his point about the negotiations, he is, I think, speaks with great maturity on this issue, because there is a chance to make progress. It will not be easy, but it clearly is not helped by the Surrender Act. But I think that neither he nor I, and that's what it is, because it would require us to take no deal off the table, neither he nor I are going to be daunted by that act. And I think that our confidence is growing, and we will work flat out to get a deal by October the 17th, and then, Mr. Speaker, this House will indeed have a chance to pronounce on it, as it was always intended that it should.
Mr. Jeremy Hunt.
Can I congratulate my right honourable friend on becoming Prime Minister, and I hope he's enjoying doing the job as much as I'm enjoying not doing the job. Does he agree that those who claim to defend parliamentary democracy are in fact putting it at grave risk by alienating a large proportion of the population who fear that this House is trying to block a democratic referendum result that we promised to honour?
Well said. It is a great pleasure to respond to my right honourable friend, because I'm reminded of the many times that he and I shared a platform, and frankly we spoke absolutely as one, Mr. Speaker, on that issue. He was right then and he is right now.
Mr. Hilary Benn.
Thank you very much. Mr. Speaker, can I say to the Prime Minister that those of us who voted for the European Union Withdrawal No. 2 Act make no apology whatsoever for having legislated to prevent the Prime Minister from taking this country out of the European Union on the 31st of October without an agreement. And the Prime Minister can shout as much as he likes from the dispatch box, but he cannot hide the fact he has no mandate, no majority and no credibility. Now, Mr. Speaker, on the 3rd of September, the Prime Minister told the House that he would bring forward proposals for an alternative to the backstop well before the end of the 30-day deadline set by Chancellor Merkel. That deadline has now passed. The EU says no such formal proposals have been tabled. Why not, and when will he do so?
Mr. Speaker, the right honourable gentleman, I think, will agree that the Surrender Act had a material. The Hilary Benn Surrender Act, Mr. Speaker, did indeed have a profound psychological impact on our friends and partners over the Channel, and it has had an impact on the negotiations, and it has made things more difficult. And I think, in all honesty, I think he would concede that. But on the detail of the negotiations at present, Mr. Speaker, all I can say is that we have tabled proposals, as the right honourable gentleman who spoke from the DUP benches just now has confirmed. Progress is being made. It is not assisted by publishing our proposals today.
Antoinette Sandbach.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister is very keen to point out how to deliver commitments made during an election. He wrote to the One Nation group during his election to be party leader that he was not much attracted to prorogation, something that he may reflect on now, and that he would seek to build consensus across the House. What undermines his negotiating position is that those watching from Europe cannot see how the Prime Minister is going to deliver a majority in this House for concessions that he will get. Can he update the House on the moves that he's taking to build consensus?
I thank the honourable lady, and actually I think she asks, Mr. Speaker, she asks an extremely important question, because I do think that in all intellectual honesty, the members opposite who voted for the Ben Burke Act, who wanted to take no deal off the table, who voted for the Surrender Act, should vote for the deal that we produce. Logically, and I'd like to hear from them that they will, Mr. Speaker. We will, I'm very confident, make progress towards getting a deal, and I hope it will command their support.
Yvette Cooper.
Earlier today, the Attorney-General did not just say that he would respect the Supreme Court's judgment, he also said, "We got it wrong." The Prime Minister has today just said the opposite and effectively said he thinks it's okay for a Prime Minister to cancel Parliament for as long as he so chooses in order to not to answer questions. Many of us have had disagreements with his predecessors, the Right Honourable Member for Maidenhead, David Cameron, John Major, Margaret Thatcher, but none of them would have done this. None of them would have been so chaotic, none of them would have shown such disregard for the rule of law or tried to concentrate power in their own hands by cancelling Parliament in this way. Why is he so entitled that he thinks it's one rule for one person and one rule for him and a different one from everyone else?
Mr. Speaker, I think the historical record will reflect that several Prime Ministers, and I think all Prime Ministers, have had prorogations, and John Major, for instance, prorogued for several weeks, I think, in advance of an election. But on her substantive question about the view of my right honourable lady colleague, the Attorney General, about the judgment yesterday, let's be clear that we are as one in respecting the Supreme Court, and we are as one in thinking that judgment was wrong.
Mr. Ian Patterson.
We were told in the general election 2015, during the passage of the referendum bill in this House, during the referendum itself, that we, the MPs, would give them the decision. It would be a final decision, and whatever the result was, we, the MPs, would honour it. Right. The crisis we have is that for the first time ever, the people have not obediently and politely gone along with what the establishment wanted. We've seen the political establishment in this House, the commercial establishment, and now the judicial establishment go against the will of the people. They are angry, they feel thwarted by the establishment. Does the Prime Minister agree that the only answer is to leave on...
Order, the Right Honourable Order! Mr. Patterson, the Right Honourable Gentleman is well, he persisted, but the Right Honourable Gentleman was entitled to be fully heard. I hope he's content. But I was trying to help the Right Honourable Gentleman. I did my best to help the Right Honourable Gentleman. Go on, blurt out the last sentence, man.
Will the Prime Minister agree with me that the only way to resolve this crisis is to leave the European Union on the 31st of October by taking back control, leaving the customs union, leaving the single market and leaving the remit of the ECJ, as we promised in our election manifesto?
Mr. Speaker, I'm very grateful to you for making sure that last sentence was heard, because I agree with every word of it, and that is exactly what we are going to do.
Stella Creasy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Earlier today, parents in Walthamstow contacted me extremely concerned about the content of a presentation about the Prime Minister's proposals and Brexit that had been broadcast on what it transpires to be 3,000 digital notice boards of primary schools around this country without the prior consent of the schools. Given the amount of money this government is spending on Brexit adverts, can he at least reassure Walthamstow residents that in this instance it wasn't his doing, and give his personal pledge that our primary schools will remain Brexit propaganda-free zones?
Obviously, I think the honourable lady is bringing me news about what schools in her constituency. What I can tell her, and what I think colleagues would like to hear, is that we're investing more in every primary school in this country by levelling up across the UK.
Penny Mordaunt.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. One of the greatest acts of patriotism shown over the last few years was not by people like myself who voted leave, but by those who voted remain and accepted the democratic result. The general public never doubted that we in this place would act on their wishes. That is the trust that they had, and I think still have, in all of us here and this Parliament. Does my right honourable friend agree that when people trust you in this way, you do not let them down?
I think my right honourable friend speaks movingly and entirely correctly about our duty to the people of this country. They are watching these proceedings. They do want us to deliver Brexit on October the 31st, and I do urge colleagues around this House to think of their responsibilities.
Anna Soubry.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, having now read the judgment of the learned judges yesterday, and this is the highest court in the land, and it was a unanimous verdict, and our congratulations go to all those who brought the action to defend this sovereign Parliament. It is quite clear that on two matters, important matters, this government did not defend, did not supply evidence. And that's why the learned judges came to the conclusions that they did. The evidence of Sir John Major was that normally a government would prorogue for some 5 days. That evidence was not challenged by this Prime Minister and that government. And they offered no evidence as to why it was they sought a prorogation of 5 weeks, which led the learned judges, paragraph 56. I'm pleased to see the Prime Minister's making a note. I hope he'll go and read the judgment. I hope he won't be honing his pole dancing skills instead. But they wrote at paragraph 56, this was not a normal prorogation in the run-up to a Queen's speech. It prevented Parliament from carrying out its constitutional role for 5 out of 8 weeks. And at paragraph 61, they don't want to hear it.
Go for it, keep going.
But they will hear it, Mr. Speaker, because this is why the learned judges unanimously concluded there was no reason, let alone a good reason, to advise Her Majesty to prorogue Parliament for 5 weeks. I came here today not just to represent my constituents, but hoping that this Prime Minister would show humility in the face of this condemnation in this judgment. Will he now apologise, if not to this place, to the country, and has he apologised to Her Majesty the Queen?
As she can imagine, I would not comment on my conversations with Her Majesty, but I think afraid she's sadly in error, Mr. Speaker, in her history, because, to my memory, John Major prorogued Parliament for 18 days before he even had an election, and all we were going to lose was 4 or 5 sitting days over the party conference period, and she will have ample opportunity after the European Union Summit on October 17th and 18th to debate Brexit again, as is her privilege and her prerogative, and indeed her pleasure. And it was always intended, Mr. Speaker, that she should.
Mr. Dominic Grieve.
Whatever policy differences the Prime Minister may have with others,
he may agree that he has an absolute duty to observe and uphold the rule of law. And whatever self-justifications he may have advanced today, he may also have to accept that in the matter of proroguing this House, he failed to do that. In those circumstances, would he now like to take the opportunity, rather than condemning the No. 2 withdrawal bill as a surrender bill, to assure the House that if the
Order. Let it be said with crystal clarity, including to occupants of the Treasury bench.
Here we go.
Yes, here we go. The right honourable and learned gentleman will be heard. He won't be shouted down by people from his own benches. That sort of behaviour is intolerable, and it is obviously so to most remotely reasonable people. Mr. Dominic Grieve.
Will he therefore take this opportunity to give an assurance to the House that should the terms of the bill apply to him, rather than going to try and die in ditches, he will observe those terms as he is duty-bound to do?
Mr. Speaker, I repeat the confirmation I've made many times that this government observes and will observe the law. But our view, I may say to my right honourable and learned friend, that our view of the particular matter that was before the Supreme Court had the support of the Master of the Rolls and the Lord Chief Justice, who at the risk of embarrassing my right honourable and learned friend, are perhaps even more distinguished in the law than he is.
Angela Eagle.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I have been a member of this House for 27 years, and I never thought I would be present to watch the benches opposite erupt in applause when a Prime Minister who has had his political strategy torn to shreds by losing 11-0 in the Supreme Court of the land and being found, in the words of the judgment, it is impossible for us to conclude on the evidence which was put before us that there was any reason, let alone a good reason, to advise Her Majesty to prorogue Parliament for 5 weeks. It follows that that decision was unlawful. Why, Mr. Speaker, do we now find this Prime Minister leading a Conservative Party that feel that it's appropriate to applaud that?
Mr. Speaker, if I may say so, I think the commentary of the involuntary commentary of the benches in this House was more directed at the Leader of the Opposition than at anything I had to say. But my strong view is that the opinion of the Supreme Court has, of course, to be respected and fulfilled, and that is why I'm pleased to say we're all here today to listen to the right honourable lady.
Sir John Hay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In 1801, Horatio Nelson, perhaps our nation's greatest hero, chose not to see advice to retreat. In that spirit, will the Prime Minister turn a blind eye to the antics of the Liberal establishment and turn a deaf ear to the shrill bleats of those who seek to foil Brexit and frustrate the will of the people? For he must know that the loud and clear cry of the working people of this country is as straightforward as this: back Brexit and back Boris.
I thank my right honourable friend. I will not only try to imitate Horatio Nelson, I will lash myself to the mast, figuratively speaking, like Odysseus, and stop my ears to the siren cries of those opposite who would try to frustrate the will of the people and block Brexit. That's what they want to do. We're not going to let them do it, Mr. Speaker.
Liz Saville Roberts.
congratulate the resilience and resoluteness of intent of the opposition leaders in the face of the Prime Minister's incontinent goading. This government will abide by legislation to extend Article 50 unless this House decides otherwise. Mr. Speaker, the Supreme Court decided that the Prime Minister did not prorogue this place in order to deliver a Queen's speech, but to stymie parliamentary debate. I would not presume to impugn the honour of the Prime Minister, but the Supreme Court clearly does not believe his motives to be, how can I put this, legitimate. Now, in 2004, the Prime Minister, who was then the Member of Parliament for Henley...
Sit down! Sit down. I'm going to try to be helpful to the honourable gentleman, who's a most dedicated and assiduous member of 2 years' standing. We don't have points of order in the middle of exchanges. I will try to provide a tutorial to the honourable gentleman on another occasion, but the honourable lady will not be prevented from asking her question. She's asking the question, she will ask it, and it will be heard. And the honourable gentleman will sit quietly and listen. Listen, Robert!
We'll find this relevant, because in 2004, the Prime Minister, MP for Henley at the time, wrote a column in the Telegraph in which he argued that Tony Blair should be impeached as he, and I quote, treated Parliament and the public with contempt over the matter of disclosure of motives and legal advice relating to the Iraq War. The Right Honourable Member even edited a copy of The Spectator, which called for Blair to be impeached for lying. He also signed an impeachment motion. Order. I have protected the honourable lady, and rightly so, from inappropriate attempts to cut her off. But she must ask a question, and I hope that she's... Order! I'm hoping very much that she's approaching the end of her question. She really does need to do so. Liz Saville-Roberts. And to close that off, the Prime Minister at the time also signed a motion for impeachment of Tony Blair, which was brought forward by the now Leader of Plaid Cymru, Adam Price. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister is surely not a man who would like to look inconsistent. So I ask him, does he still believe it to be right and proper to seek to impeach a Prime Minister who has been judged to mislead the public? Already explained once. Let me say to the honourable gentleman again, in terms that brook of no misunderstanding, now is not the time for points of order. That time will come, and if the honourable gentleman's still interested, he'll be heard. But he really does need to learn the procedures in these matters. The Prime Minister.
I thank the Right Honourable Lady very much for her question. I'm glad that she's such an assiduous reader of my column, Mr. Speaker, but I must correct her on two important points, or make clear two important things. The first is that the Supreme Court did not impugn the motives of the government at all. And the second, I think she should bear in mind, is that Wales voted leave.
And Maine.
Speaker, when it suits politicians, they promise elections and referenda. And indeed, in 2008, the Liberal Democrats promised a referendum on the future in and out. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that those who shouted the loudest for a referendum are now promising revoke, and that is undemocratic? Just as it is undemocratic to be bench-blocking and refusing the public the chance to decide to have a government that can be in power, not just in office.
Well, my honourable friend is entirely right, of course, and the absurdity of the Liberal Democrat position is only equalled, if not surpassed, by the absurdity of the Labour position, because they, after all, are committed to negotiating a new deal with the European Union and then campaigning against it.
Jess Phillips.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I know that the Prime Minister wants to appear as a strong man, but the strongest thing he could do that would look the best to this country at the moment would be to act with some humility and contrition. There are many of them, but the difference between the Prime Minister and myself is if the Labour Party had done this, I would be ashamed. I would be sorry that the Labour Party had been found to do this. And I ask the Prime Minister, simply, this looks horrendous to the public, and he thinks he speaks for the people. Let me tell you now, it will look much better if the Prime Minister rises to his feet now and says, I am sorry, I got this wrong. Let's try honesty.
Well, I'm grateful to the honourable lady, and I may say that I think, I do accept the judgment of the Supreme Court, as I've said many times, I think, this afternoon. But I also may say to her, in all candour, I think that the humblest and most responsible thing that we could all do as parliamentarians is show that we respect the judgment of the people and take this country out on October the 31st.
Steve Brine.
Much, Mr. Speaker. Back on the 3rd of September, I asked the Prime Minister, given his view then that the chances of a deal had increased and that things were moving, as he said to me at the time, what evidence of that progress he could put before the House. Now, I think the Prime Minister is unfairly maligned, because I have sat face to face with him, as have many, and I know he wants a deal. So, in the light of encouraging noises from him and from his ministers in recent days, and as he said in his statement from the EU, could I just ask him again this evening, when he says we are making progress, what that progress looks like? Because I know he needs to bring together a majority in and across this House in order to get it through and to show that to our EU leaders, and I think that he is unfairly maligned, as I say. So, what can he put before the House to give us that encouragement?
I'm really grateful to my honourable friend, and as I said to the House in my opening statement, we've moved a long way off the idea that the withdrawal agreement was the law of the Medes and the Persians, fixed, immutable, graven in tablets of stone. That's absolutely gone. We've moved a long way from the idea that the backstop had to be retained in all circumstances. He will have heard Jean-Claude Juncker himself say that he no longer had any, I think he said, any erotic fixation with the backstop. In concrete terms, the three, and this will perhaps be helpful to the House, the three areas in which progress is being made are the concept of the alternative arrangements, which I know has been discussed many times in this House, and many right honourable members have gone over it many times, but it is a fruitful area of discussion. The second idea, which is also extremely fruitful, is the concept of doing everything we can to maintain the unity of the island of Ireland for sanitary and phytosanitary purposes. And as I'm sure my honourable friend who has studied these matters closely will acknowledge, that is a big concession by the UK government and a big advance, and it needs to be handled with care. We need to get the balance right, but we think that progress can be made in that area. And the third concept, and I mentioned it already in my opening remarks, Mr. Speaker, is the idea of consent. And I think consent holds the key, because the problem with the backstop, as honourable members opposite will recall, because I heard some very good speeches against it from the benches opposite, the problem with the backstop is it doesn't repose the locus of authority here in the UK, and we need to remedy that, and I'm sure he understands that point too.
Gloria De Piero.
Mr. Speaker, I campaigned to remain, the Prime Minister campaigned to leave, but I've always respected the result of the referendum. Now, to be honest, I don't want to work with him any more than he would want to work with me. But we both know that there are areas where both parties reached an agreement in those cross-party talks. So will he publish the areas of agreement from those cross-party talks, and will he use them as the basis for a new bill so we can stop no-deal Brexit and leave by the 31st of October with a deal?
Well, I can tell the honourable lady that I certainly admire the way that she's trying to work cross-party to bring this to a resolution, and I will take up her proposal and do what I can to bring it forward over the next few days. I appreciate that time is obviously marching and very tight.
Victoria Prentice.
Mr. Speaker. Significant numbers of MPs from across the House are coming together to indicate that they are MPs for a deal. Would the Prime Minister confirm, firstly, that he is one of us, secondly, that he is working hard for a deal, and thirdly, that we will have the opportunity to vote on another deal?
I can certainly I thank my honourable friend for what she's doing, and also I think with my right honourable friend, the member for Cheltenham, who I think is involved in the cross-party work for members for a deal. I can absolutely guarantee that if and when we are able to bring back an agreement that I think will work for this House and for this country on October the 17th and 18th, of course we will put it to Parliament, and I do hope that it will then get assent.
Joanna Cherry.
In my naivety, Mr. Speaker, I thought we were coming to hear a statement on the Supreme Court judgment. But instead we've been treated to the sort of populist rant one expects to hear from the leader of a tin-pot dictatorship, or perhaps the current president of the States. Does the Prime Minister appreciate that his display is anathema to the democratic constitutional tradition of Scotland, which was upheld in the UK Supreme Court yesterday? And I pray to God, Mr. Speaker, that he won't take his own country onto the rocks. But if he's intent on doing that, will he first of all recognise the democratic mandate of the Scottish Parliament? He spoke a moment ago about consent to be governed holding the key. Exactly. If he must take England on the rocks, and I hope he doesn't, will he recognise the democratic mandate of the Scottish Parliament and agree the means for a second independence referendum to be held in Scotland?
Well, Mr. Speaker, if I may say, I do congratulate the honourable lady for bringing forward that action, because she did produce an astonishing result. Let's be in no doubt. It was a groundbreaking judgment. It was a novel judgment, and of course it's had the effect that we can all see before us today. Here we are back in this House of Commons. But I may say on her second point, the people of Scotland voted decisively in 2014 to remain in the United Kingdom, the most successful union of nations in history, and they were told that it was a once-in-a-generation vote. I think it absolutely wrong of her now to try to break that promise.
Dr. Julian Lewis.
When the Prime Minister eventually wins an overall majority at the next general election, will he make it a priority of his first majority government to repeal forthwith the ghastly fixed-term Parliament Act?
Mr. Speaker, I think we're going to concentrate on winning that overall majority first, and I share his sentiments entirely.
Rachel Reeves.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This afternoon has been a horrendous spectacle. We've got a Prime Minister who has broken the law and uses dangerous language of betrayal and surrender, which sows division and worse in the communities that we all serve. And then we have his MPs who clap him for doing so. But what this afternoon has taught us is how important it is that Parliament is sitting through these crucial weeks, because it is only through Parliament sitting that we can hold this government to account. And that's why it's so important that Parliament is not dissolved for a general election or prorogued again, so we can continue to hold this government to account, because if the Prime Minister has broken the law once, why should we trust him not to do the same again?
Well, I must respectfully disagree with the honourable lady in her characterisation of the Surrender Act, because I do think it does. I'm afraid it has done damage. It has done damage, and was intended to damage this country's negotiating position. But I do think that it is also right. It is also right in this context to work hard together to get a deal done and to deliver on the mandate of the people, because I think that is what her constituents would want to see.
Thank you.
Mr. Richard Drax.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I commend my right honourable friend for his firm stance on this whole argument? And can I also ask him that when he comes back, possibly with a deal, it does not mirror in any way, shape or form the deal that has already been thrown out of this House? I, for one, and I believe the people of this country, do not want to remain in a vassal state, or with vassal state status, for years to come. Let's get this done and leave the EU.
My honourable friend is valiant for truth in this matter, and he is right. The problem with the previously existing withdrawal agreement is it does or would keep the UK locked in the EU in tantamount to vassalage, and we will make sure that the deal we do bears no resemblance whatever to that predicament, and we will have a deal that I believe he can fully support.
Next questioner, Alison McGovern.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The irony is not lost on any of us that prorogation was nothing to do with Brexit, the Prime Minister told us, yet here we are talking constantly about Brexit. But it's a more serious it's the more serious point about our political culture, Mr. Speaker, that I want to raise with the Prime Minister, because those of us who constantly remember our friend Jo Cox need our political culture to change now. It is getting toxic, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister's language is violent and his government is dysfunctional. So will he promise us that he will change? And can I ask him, just for this session, to take responsibility for his actions? Can he accept that he acted unlawfully? And bearing in mind that this issue is about advice to our monarch, will he tell us which of his ministers will resign?
I agree with the honourable lady that tempers have become very ragged across the country, and people feel the fever of Brexit, and I agree with her, has gone on for too long. But the best way to sort this out is to get Brexit done. And that is what we want. And I hope that she will join with us in getting a good deal for this country and getting it through this House of Commons.
Justine Greening.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister's talked about bringing a deal back to this House. He's also talked about his respect for the law and agreeing to make sure that he complies with the law. So can I ask him to be absolutely explicit that if he does bring a deal back to this House, and this House does what its right is, perhaps, and rejects it, that he will respect that, but he will also respect the so-called Ben Bill that this House has passed, and then ask for an extension? And can I just say to him that continuing to call a bill that this House has passed a surrender bill is deeply disrespectful to this place, and he has said he must respect the Supreme Court ruling, and I would simply ask him to respect the decisions of this House too.
I must say to the Right Honourable Lady and my friend, the Right Honourable Lady, who I've worked with happily over many years, that actually I do think that the Surrender Act has done grave damage. What it would try to do, I speak as somebody who has to sit in.
Order. Can I appeal to colleagues in all parts of the House to calm down and let's have the exchanges. Everybody must speak in terms that he or she thinks fit, and I know we're all conscious of the premium that is placed by Erskine May on moderation and good humour in the use of parliamentary language. The Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I repeat that the experience of negotiating with our European friends and partners over the last few weeks has, I'm afraid, confirmed me in my view that the Surrender Act has made it more difficult for us to get a deal. And that is the sad truth, because they hear what they hear is a Parliament that is determined not just to stop a no-deal Brexit. That is not their intention. Their intention is to stop any kind of deal at all. That is what they want to do. And I can tell my right honourable friend that we will come out of the European Union on October the 31st, and we will not be extending.
Order, Sheriff.
Mr. Speaker, I genuinely do not seek to stifle robust debate, but this evening the Prime Minister has continually used pejorative language to describe an Act of Parliament passed by this House. And I'm sure that you would agree, Mr. Speaker, that we should not resort to using offensive, dangerous or inflammatory language for legislation that we do not like. And we stand here, Mr. Speaker, under the shield of our departed friend, with many of us in this place subject to death threats and abuse every single day. And let me tell the Prime Minister that they often quote his words: surrender act, betrayal, traitor. And I, for one, am sick of it. We must moderate our language, and it has to come from the Prime Minister first.
Absolutely.
So I would be interested in hearing his opinion. He should be absolutely ashamed of himself.
I think, Mr. Speaker, I have to say, Mr. Speaker, I have to say, Mr. Speaker, I've never heard such humbug in all my life. Because the reality is, this is a bill.
Order. I appeal to the House as a whole to debate these issues calmly. I can see the gesticulation from colleagues, and I am not... Order. Mr. Linden, please, allow me to respond. I am not unmindful of the purport of that gesticulation. I have reminded colleagues across the House of the very long-established precepts of Erskine May in relation to the conduct of debate. I must simply say that nothing disorderly has been said. Everybody must make his own or her own judgment as to how to behave in this place, and all members will operate at the level that they think appropriate. If I see that there is disorderly behaviour, I will rule accordingly, and if I hear disorderly words, I will rule them out of order. I wanted to hear the honourable member for Dewsbury, and did so in full, as she absolutely had to be heard. I have listened to the reply. Let's try to respect order. No assistance is required. Let's try to respect each other. The Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, let me just explain why I call it the Surrender Act. And that is because it would oblige us to stay in the EU for month after month at a cost of £1 billion per month. It would take away from this country the ability to decide how long that extension would be, and it would give that power to the EU. It would absolutely undermine our ability to continue to negotiate properly in Brussels. It takes away the fundamental ability of a country to walk away from the negotiations, and I'm afraid that is exactly what it does. And the best way, if I may say respectfully to members opposite who are getting very agitated about this, the best way to get rid of the Surrender Act is not to have voted for it in the first place, to repeal it and to vote for the deal that we are going to do. That is the way forward.
Vicky Ford.
Mr. Speaker, many of my constituents watch Parliament TV, and whilst we were away, they watched Catch Up, including an interesting episode where most eloquently the member from East Dunbartonshire said that she wanted a referendum. It should be an in-out referendum and people should decide. Does my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, agree with me that if the Liberals were Democrats, they should be working for ways to help deliver that referendum and heal the divisions, not create more?
My right honourable friend is entirely right, and the way forward for this House and for this country is to get Brexit done. And I think that actually there are people around this country who are watching these proceedings and who will agree very, very profoundly with what I'm saying. Get Brexit done and let's take this country forward.
I do just want to emphasise in these proceedings, members must say what they think, and they do, and that's right, on both sides of the House and on different sides of this argument. But I would like to emphasise that I am keenly conscious of the fact that there are members on both sides of the House, and indeed on both sides of the Brexit argument, who have been personally threatened and whose families have been threatened. And it is incredibly... No, but members on both sides of the House and on both sides of the argument have been threatened. And I have stated very publicly my revulsion at such behaviour, whether it has affected members on one side or the other, people who are anti-Brexit or members who are pro-Brexit, whose families have been wrongly threatened or whose parents have been abused in their presence. And I would simply appeal to responsible colleagues in all parts of the House to weigh their words. That's all I'm saying. I think that is a reasonable request of members in all parts of the House. It is in our wider interest as a Parliament, and it is in the public interest that we respect each other. That is a point which I think shouldn't be difficult to understand. Steve Double. I beg your pardon.
Following the events of yesterday, I've had many constituents contact me. Some are confused, bewildered, some are frustrated and angry. The vast majority of my constituents do not have the funding or the influence or the contacts to pursue matters in the Supreme Court. But what they do have is a vote. And in June 2016, they gave their vote. 64% of my constituency voted to leave, believing that their vote would count and the result would be honoured. Would the Prime Minister reassure my constituents that the events of yesterday will in no way detract from his determination to honour the referendum and ensure we leave the EU?
I can certainly give my honourable friend that absolute assurance, and we are working for a deal on October the 17th, but we will come out, if we must, without a deal on October the 31st.
Mr. Speaker, I have never felt so embarrassed to be a Member of Parliament here this evening. We know the impact of the Prime Minister's language and behaviour is having on the people out there in the country and on us as Member of Parliament. I alone have seen a huge escalation just today in the abuse on social media and the language and incitement that he is causing. This has got to stop. So why doesn't he listen to what the court said yesterday? Say sorry about that. Say sorry. And then let's do the democratic thing. And actually, yes, let's put it back to the people for a final say.
Mr. Speaker, and mindful of what you have said about the Surrender Act, I must say that I do appreciate that tensions on this matter are high, but I want to be very clear with the honourable lady opposite There is only one way to end those tensions in this country, and that is to get Brexit on. And if she really thinks that by staying on in the EU month after month after October the 31st, those tensions, that acrimony, all that storm on Twitter is going to abate, she's got another thing coming. Let's get this thing done.
Greg Hands.
Speaker, I'm glad to hear of the Prime Minister's continuing commitment to getting a deal. And it seems to me that that deal will inevitably be based around alternative arrangements. He mentioned the discussions in Brussels, but also crucial in this will be discussions in Belfast and in Dublin. Could he give us an update on his meeting with Leo Varadkar on Monday in New York? Did they discuss alternative arrangements, and what is his view?
I really thank my right honourable friend, because he's played a huge role in developing the whole concept of alternative arrangements, and yes, that played a large part in our conversation in Monday with the Taoiseach. I think it would be over-optimistic, Mr. Speaker, to say that that alone can solve the problem. There remain difficult issues, as I'm sure he understands, about customs, and we really must make progress on that issue.
Caroline Lucas.
Mr. Speaker, the tone of the Prime Minister's speech was truly shocking, and if he says that he recognises that tensions are inflamed, then it is up to him not to stoke them further, whipping up hatred, treating Parliament with contempt and dividing our country still further. Now, this populist rhetoric isn't only unfitting for a Prime Minister, but it is genuinely, seriously dangerous, as our friends across the aisle have just said. So I ask him again a very simple question. If he trusts the people as much as he says he does, then why will he not allow them to have a final say on his deal? He says he wants to get this over quickly. That is the quickest way to get a resolution to this crisis.
Obviously, I would like Parliament to have a say on the deal that we do, but I think the best way to get the people to have a say is to have a general election, and I hope she will support that.
Mr. Kevin Hollingbrake.
Mr. Speaker, one of the precedents quoted by the Supreme Court yesterday was a 1965 ruling that a government could not deprive individuals or companies of their assets without fair compensation. What implications does my right honourable friend think this might have for a future Labour Party manifesto?
I'm delighted that my right honourable friend has mentioned that with his characteristic acuity and his support of property and the rights of people across this country, because they are going to be despoiled if the right honourable general opposite ever got anywhere near power. He has a Maduro-esque plan to take away private property from great schools across the country, and indeed to incur the taxpayer of the kind that he intended himself, by the way, in an ecstasy of hypocrisy, and thereby to incur the taxpayer with £7 billion of pointless extra cost to pay for the education of the children concerned.
Chris Bryant.
Mr. Speaker, since we are definitely going to be sitting for at least a few more days, wouldn't it make more sense for the government to bring forward something that the whole House can agree on? 2 women are killed on average by their domestic partners every week of the year in this country. The government has a domestic abuse bill which is ready to go. Why don't we do second reading of that on Monday or Tuesday? The whole of the House would agree. We'd be able to send it off into committee, and if we were eventually to have another Queen's speech, then we'd be able to have carryover for it. It's time we defended the women of this country.
I quite agree with the right honourable gentleman. He's absolutely right, and it is one of the reasons that I want to have a Queen's speech, that we can bring back the domestic violence bill.
Mr. Martin Vickers.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I draw the Prime Minister's attention to an email I received from Port Equipment Engineering Limited, who are based at Immingham in my constituency. They say the people voted to leave and this has to be respected. Pushing it back further would certainly cause damage to the local area. Please represent us in Parliament and speak of the massive impact this is having and how it will escalate quickly with further problems. Could I urge the Prime Minister to stick to his guns, deliver on the 31st of October? The Port of Immingham is ready and waiting and hopefully getting Freeport status when after we leave.
I thought that was coming, Mr. Speaker. Well, I certainly am grateful for his support in my ambition to get Brexit done by October the 31st. And apart from anything else, it will not only help to take the sting out of the current conversation, I think calm everybody down, but it will deliver the business certainty and confidence that they've been crying out for around the whole United Kingdom.
Lady Herman.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. I have to tell the Prime Minister I was shocked that he, as the Prime Minister, should take it upon himself, with his arrogance, to declare the judgment of the Supreme Court as being wrong. It was the Supreme Court, the highest court of the land. 11 judges who were unanimous, but the Prime Minister has declared this evening that their decision was wrong. He hasn't explained the grounds, but he's declared them to be wrong. If the Prime Minister believes that, does the Prime Minister also believe that it is lawful for him to call another lengthy prorogation of this Parliament? And if he has that in his mind, when is he going to enlighten us as to when that prorogation is going to begin?
I'm grateful to the Right Honourable Lady, but what I can tell her is that I do think we need a Queen's speech. I do think that we have a dynamic domestic agenda that we need to push forward, and I will be informing her as well as the rest of the House as soon as we have assessed the meaning of the judgment in its entirety and when it would be appropriate to do so.
How long can it take you?
Rory Stewart.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Like my right honourable friend, I support a Brexit deal, and indeed I voted for it considerably more frequently than my right honourable friend. But if this great party stands for anything, it stands for respect for parliamentary sovereignty and the rule of law. And I would respectfully say my right honourable friend is tiptoeing onto a dangerous path. He's pitting Brexit against Remain, young against old, Scotland against England, and people against the Parliament. And would my right honourable friend please reflect on the fact that this Brexit deal is not a deal just for the next 5 years. It's the foundation of our relationship with Europe for the next 40, and that requires us to speak with respect, with moderation, with compassion for our opponents in order to provide a foundation that does not just appeal to a single narrow faction, but to every citizen and party in this great country.
Thank you. I thank my right honourable friend. I think the juxtaposition actually is between democracy, which we are sticking up for, and the will of the people, and dither and delay, which is what the party opposite is standing for. And that seems to be a very clear dividing line, and I know which side I'm on.
Stephen Gethins.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, earlier on the Prime Minister referenced the Stasi. So he must rejoice with me the fact that countries across Eastern Europe believe that their independence and sovereignty is enhanced by their membership of the European Union, just as the rule of law is enhanced by that membership. So, if all of the criteria are fulfilled by the, let's call it, the Parliamentary Sovereignty and Rule of Law Act, and if he is still Prime Minister on the 19th of October, will he reassure me, when I don't think he respects the rule of law anymore, reassure me, prove me wrong, tell me he'll sign that extension?
Mr. Speaker, if he doesn't want to call it, what about the Humiliation Act? Will that do any better? Because that's what it's intended to do. But on his substantive point about respecting the rule of law, I've made that clear several times to this House. We will, of course, respect the law.
Mr. Richard Graham.
Speaker, the problem with the bill that the Prime Minister calls the Surrender Act is that many of those who supported it were not so much against no deal as against leaving the European Union altogether. But there are many of us, on both sides of the House, who support the Prime Minister's stated goal of coming back with a deal from the European Union October Council and leaving the EU at the end of October. Can I therefore urge my right honourable friend, firstly, to maximise the 2 weeks negotiating opportunity, and secondly, to reach out across the House to all those on both sides who genuinely want to leave the EU, but in the best possible way.
Of course, I thank my right honourable friend. He's completely right, and we will reach out to members across all sides of the House, and I hope that our overtures will be received in a kindly spirit.
Helen Goodman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I must say, I feel that the Prime Minister's goading of my colleagues from Yorkshire reveals that he has changed little since he was a student burning £50 notes in front of homeless people. I do have a real question. The problem is this was billed as a statement on the Prime Minister's update. Rather than just talking about vague concepts, could the Prime Minister tell the House what proposals he has tabled to the European Union?
Good question. Mr. Speaker, the Right Honourable Lady opposite has made an allegation about my conduct as a student, which I'm afraid, if it were allowed to stand, would enter the record. She has no evidence for it whatever, because it is completely untrue. And I would like you to ask the Right Honourable Lady to withdraw it.
Well, I'm most grateful to the Prime Minister. The Honourable Lady has said what she said, but the Prime Minister... The Prime Minister from the dispatch box, and with the full authority of his office, and knowing his own background, and recognising the duty of every member to speak the truth in this chamber, has exercised his freedom, and quite rightly so. The Prime Minister, I think, would readily acknowledge that in the light of all that, he doesn't require any additional protection from me. He has put the record straight, and it's there. It's on the record, and I thank the Right Honourable gentleman. Caroline Noakes.
Mr. Speaker, what matters in this place is not just language, but also tone. I noted that my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, earlier spoke of political cowardice. I wish to speak to him of political bravery. Politics is the art of the possible. I genuinely believe it is possible for him to get a new deal. Further, I believe it is possible for it to pass this House. But it would be politically brave not simply to reach across the House, but brave to put his arms around the House.
I thank my right honourable friend, and I will do my best. I will do my best to do... Mr. Speaker, it's an invitation that is clearly not universally welcomed, but I do share her idealism. I do think there is a chance for us now to do our duty by our constituents and to put this matter to rest, and in a way that I think will greatly alleviate the tensions that are now current in our country. And I think it will be a great thing for our country if we do that. So I will follow her urgings and do my best to show the spirit that she asked for.
Well, I think the moment has arrived for the honourable gentleman member for Kingston upon Hull East, whose noisy activities I was remarking upon in a number of cities around the world last week. We so often hear him yelling from a sedentary position. Let's now hear him from a standing position. Mr. Carl Turner.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. I think it really is an absolute disgrace that the Prime Minister has been dragged here by the most senior judges from the highest court in the land, because the advice that the Leader of the House gave to Her Majesty the Queen was held to be unlawful. But he comes here laughing and joking and using aggressive language when honourable members on this side make very salient and serious points? Why does he think he can treat the Queen and country with such utter contempt?
Well, I have the utmost respect, not just for the court, but also, of course, for the honourable gentleman. And if I may say, the way in which I think we could all show respect to our constituents, and particularly, I think, his own constituents who voted very heavily to leave the EU, would be to vote for the deal when we bring it back to you. And I hope you'll support us in the lobbies.
Stephen Metcalfe.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and it's good to see my honourable friend back in his rightful place a little earlier than perhaps he had assumed it would be, and I hope he remains there a very long time. Can he give me some advice that I can share with my constituents when I try to explain why this Parliament refuses to approve a general election, refuses to vote to leave the EU, refuses to respect the wishes of 17.4 million people, and refuses to honour the views of 73% of my constituents who voted to lose? Can he give me some advice to help me on the doorstep?
I thank my honourable friend, and he is completely right. The way to address the feelings of his constituents, of my constituents, of all of our constituents, and frankly the way to puncture the great poisonous puffball of Brexit is just to get on and make sure that the very word, and I know there's a lot of anxiety about language, let's make sure that the very word Brexit is never heard in 2020. Wouldn't that be a fantastic thing?
Caroline Flynn.
Mr. Speaker, I'm bitterly disappointed that Parliament didn't have the chance to agree to forego the nearly 4 weeks of the conference recess so we could spend more time together. But I'd have to say to the Prime Minister, in seeking to prorogue Parliament, I think he's shown a serious lack of judgment. And I only hope that and his tone improves from today. Can I ask the Prime Minister, should he secure a deal with the EU 27 at the EU summit in October, will he invite Parliament to have a vote to ratify, under a meaningful vote, on Saturday the 19th of November, that deal, and by doing so, meet the terms of the EU Withdrawal No. 2 Act?
I'm grateful, Mr. Speaker. I think the honourable lady meant to say October rather than November. What I can certainly tell her, and I thank her very much with the sincerity with which she approaches this issue, and clearly I do want to work together with all members of the House of Commons to try to get this thing done. We will, if we can get a deal at the summit, we will of course be putting it to Parliament.
Charlie Elphick.
Mr. Speaker, I backed Remain in the referendum, but my constituency and my country decided otherwise. And so I thought it was my duty as a member of this House to accept those instructions and that mandate and execute it faithfully. And my constituents say, after 3 years, this Parliament has achieved nothing. It is a rump Parliament. So can I ask the Prime Minister, what representations has he had from the minor parties in relation to a confidence vote or an election vote, as well as the Labour Party, to bring forward a general election so that people can have their say and settle this question for good?
Thank you. I'm afraid my honourable friend is absolutely right. I've yet to hear either from the main opposition party or indeed any of the opposition parties that they're willing to take up our democratic challenge, but I want to thank him and to congratulate him for what he has done for Dover, where I have been and been very, very impressed with the level of preparations, and honourable members opposite who are anxious might educate themselves by going to see what has been done at Dover, and I congratulate my honourable friend for the leadership that he has shown.
Karen Bark.
Tonight, the Prime Minister has made calculatedly inflammatory comments against parliamentarians, and he will be accountable for the consequences of that language. But I want to ask him about the judiciary. In the last 36 hours, we have seen an unprecedented onslaught on the impartiality and integrity of our judges. Parliamentarians, and in particular ministers of the government, have a duty to uphold the independence and integrity of the judges. So will he take the opportunity that he did not take earlier when asked by the Leader of the Opposition and distance himself specifically from the comments of the Leader of the House that yesterday's judgment was a constitutional coup?
I'm not going to comment on anything that was said by any member of the Cabinet, but what I can say during Cabinet, because that would be totally wrong, because of course there is a risk of serious distortion in the reporting. What I can say is that the Government has the utmost respect for the judiciary and indeed for the judgment, and that is why we're all here today. And I think it has actually been to the advantage of the House to hear a little bit about the negotiations, but I think the House will also understand that some of the measures that have been passed by the House, or at least one of the measures that has been passed by the House, has not made negotiation any easier. And I'm just saying that to you in all candour and sincerity, and I think honourable members know that.
Mr. David Trudinick.
Mr. Speaker, excuse me, Mr. Speaker. Am I right? Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My voice is restored. My right honourable friend has talked about a Surrender Act, which I think is quite accurate. Does he recall, as I do, because I was in the House at the time, the 1989 Community Charge Act, which was persistently described as a poll tax by the opposition, deliberately to stoke up anger and opposition in the country?
I appreciate the good humour of the honourable gentleman. I'm sorry that he was struggling with his throat, but it was suggested to me that he could usefully take a herbal remedy. Yeah. The Prime Minister.
I thought that was coming, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my honourable friend, my right honourable friend. He makes a very good point. And all I will say again, at the risk of further inflaming my friends opposite, I must say that the bill in question, the Capitulation Act, has done material damage to this country's ability to negotiate. And I think that they should reflect on that, because in an international negotiation, it is very important that the UK is able to deploy every possible arsenal, every possible negotiating tool. And I'm afraid that an attempt has been made to weaken our hand. There's no question of it.
Yes. Tracy Brabin.
Thank you so much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, hearing from the Prime Minister words like the Humiliation Act, the Surrender Act, the Capitulation Act, all of these words are suggesting that we, because we disagree with him, we are traitors. We are not patriots. Nothing could be further from the truth. Now, this may be a strategy to set the people against the establishment. I would like to gently suggest he is the establishment and we are still people. As the woman who has taken over a seat that was left by our dear friend Joe Cox, can I ask him, in all honesty, as a human being, please, will he, going forward, moderate his language so that we will all feel secure when we're going about our jobs?
Can I say that the surest far away? Well, no, Mr. Speaker, I think of course there will be an attempt to try to obfuscate the effect of this act, but it does, the Capitulation Act or the Surrender Act or whatever you want to call it, it does, I'm sorry, but it greatly enfeebles its government's ability to negotiate. But what I will say is that the best way to honour the memory of Joe Cox, and indeed the best way to bring this country together, would be, I think, to get Brexit done. And I absolutely do. And I think that it is the continuing inability of this Parliament to get Brexit done that is causing the anxiety and the ill feeling that is now rampant in our country. And get it done and we will solve the problem.
James Cartledge.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Whatever one calls the European Union Withdrawal Act number 2, is it not a fact? It does not take no deal permanently off the table. It would delay it till the end of January. And does he agree there are only two ways for those of us who are concerned about no deal to stop that outcome permanently? That is either to revoke Article 50, with all that implies for democracy, or it is to do the right thing, come together and pass a deal which I have every confidence he will obtain in the European Council.
I congratulate my honourable friend, because that is exactly the right answer. I think the best way forward genuinely for our country is to come together and to do a deal, and that is what I hope that colleagues will do.
Marsha de Cordova.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, the Supreme Court ruled unanimously that the Prime Minister and his government tried to unlawfully prorogue this place. The Prime Minister has come here today without a shred of humility. He has been using divisive language and has failed to offer an apology. So I will ask him once again, as many members have tried to, will he now apologise to the people in my constituency and the wider country for trying to shut down democracy? And will he also commit to ensuring that he will not attempt to try and prorogue this House again?
I say, Mr. Speaker, I think the best way to shut down democracy in this country and to erode trust in our political institutions is to fail to deliver on the will of the 17.4 million people who voted to leave. And that is what we're going to do.
Bob Seeley.
Indeed, Mr. Speaker, there have been some challenges for the Prime Minister. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There have been some challenges.
I've known the honourable gentleman member for the Isle of Wight for a long time, and I'm not surprised but very pleased to see that, notwithstanding some sedentary heckling, the honourable gentleman's still got a smile on his face, and that's a good thing. Bob Seeley.
He blocked in that ear because I can't hear them anyway. There have been some challenges for the Prime Minister in recent weeks, but is he aware that the more the people, my folks on the Isle of Wight, see the obstacles being put in his way, whether they're political from people in this House or European leaders or others, including judges, the more that they are willing him on, the more that they want him to stick the course to deliver Brexit on the 31st of October and restore trust in our politics.
I thank my honourable friend, who is a doughty and mighty campaigner for the Isle of Wight, as I've seen myself, and I thought he was going to ask me about the island deal that we're going to do, but I can assure him that we are, don't worry. But he's totally right. There are obstacles being thrown in our path. The conversations are difficult, but I think with goodwill from the other side of this House, we can still do it.
Peter Kyle.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister has proven that when you live behind a wall of armed police officers, you can be as irresponsible as you like with your language, because he will never have to live with the consequences of the people who have been speaking up to him today in all sincerity. But when it comes to the Supreme Court case, which this is supposed to be about today, could he explain something? Every other participant in the case provided witness statements that were sworn. Why didn't he, and why didn't the government?
The government provided all the evidence that we were asked. All the evidence that we were asked to provide. And I may say, he talks about. I was mayor of London for 8 years. I cycled. I went around everywhere with a bicycle, on a bicycle, with no protection whatever, and I was very proud of it. And believe me, the best way to ensure that every parliamentarian is properly safe, and we dial down the current anxiety in this country, is to get Brexit done. And so I hope you'll support us.
Peter says.
Dr. Caroline Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Whether the bill is referred to as the Ben Bill, the Humiliation Act, the Capitulation Act or the Surrender Bill, does my right honourable friend agree with me that it still has the same effect of ceding, giving up or yielding control of when we leave the EU to the Europeans, weakening his hand to get a deal in the first place?
my honourable friend is, I'm afraid, absolutely right. And so all those who deprecate the description of this bill, the best thing that they could do, in my view, is repeal it, get rid of its effect, or even better, support us in going for a better deal.
Yeah, okay.
Tom Brake.
No contrition, no shame and no apology for breaking the law. Does the Prime Minister understand why many people in this country think he's unfit to be our Prime Minister?
I think that the right honourable gentleman could easily test that proposition if he had the gumption to go for a general election, or indeed a vote of no confidence, which he's failing to do.
Alex Chalk. The Prime Minister secures a deal, I will vote for it. Does he agree that the British people are fed up with hearing for 3 years what this House is against, and it's high time that it heard what this House is for?
My honourable friend has spoken for Cheltenham, and he is completely right. That is what the people of this country want to see. They want to see us coming together, agreeing on a way forward, getting Brexit done, and then getting on with a dynamic one-nation Conservative agenda, and that's what we're going to do.
Thangham Debonair.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in the last 2 hours and 7 minutes, the Prime Minister has mocked us, belittled us, told us it's his way or nothing, used language that he knows incites fear, he's patronised us, he's shown disregard for the law, he's tried to make us feel that our views have no value when we are trying to represent our constituents. He's done all of this over the most important matter of our times at a time of national crisis. I'm not asking him to apologise to us, although I think he should. I'm asking him to apologise to my constituents who didn't want us to be prorogued in the first place, and who yesterday the Supreme Court said they agreed with him. So I ask him now, will he apologise to the people of Bristol West and start taking this House seriously?
I thank her, but I do take this House exceptionally seriously, and I may say to her that I certainly do, and I think that actually it is our constituents, all of them, across this whole country, who feel that their opinions are being undervalued, because they expressed an opinion 3 years ago, and this House, in spite of countless promises, has failed to implement that opinion. And I suggest the best thing is to get on and do it.
David Duquette.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The SNP, as vocal as they are, want to ignore the 2016 result and have another Brexit referendum.
We won in Scotland.
As if by magic, I could have almost scripted that response. Because they are also, by shouting out that they won in Scotland, it wasn't a Scotland-wide vote. It was a vote by individuals, as is any referendum. But it just shows that they have also ignored the 2014 referendum, in which the people of Scotland voted to remain in the United Kingdom, who is the member state of the EU that is leaving the EU. So can the Prime Minister confirm that only the Conservative Party in Scotland and across the United Kingdom are committed to delivering on both of those people's votes?
Fantastic. I thank my honourable friend, because he is perfectly right, and I've seen at first hand what a fantastic campaigner he is for his own constituents, and there is a sharp distinction between him and the Scottish Nationalist Party, because he has a plan, once we take back control of Scotland's extraordinary fisheries, to boost that industry, whereas they, of course, would hand it back to Brussels. And I congratulate him on what he's doing.
Sarah Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Times today said the whole point of Conservative government is to provide an executive aware of its limitations and sensitive to the dangers of overreaching them. A Tory believes that the rule of law is always to be preferred to arbitrary power. Without these things, what is the point of the Conservatives? The Prime Minister, Mr. Speaker, has just told my friend that the best way to honour the memory of Joe Cox is to get Brexit done. He has broken the law and he has not apologised for it. Constituents of mine, good Conservative voters, are asking themselves, what on earth has the Prime Minister done to his party, let alone our country? Will he now resign?
I have the utmost respect for the law and indeed for the judgment of the Supreme Court. But I think what the people of this country want us to do in this Parliament, as I have said several times already this evening, is to deliver on the mandate of the people. And that is what we are going to do.
Hugh Merriman.
Mr. Speaker, a few weeks ago I asked the Prime Minister a question to which he responded, "Sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander." Now, I understand what that phrase means, but I've yet to meet a single constituent who does. So can I try again on their behalf? In the event that the Prime Minister gets a deal, which I fully support him with, will he ensure that any member of the Conservative Party benches who doesn't vote for that deal will lose the whip and will lose the right to stand as a Conservative candidate in the general election?
I think I've said what I've said to my honourable friend in the past. I see no reason to go over the point again, because I think what we all want to do is get on and get the best deal possible that can be supported across this House, and that, I think, is the best way forward for this. And they say they're not going to vote for it under any circumstances, and that is because they want to stop Brexit. It's perfectly clear from what they're saying.
Stuart Malcolm MacDonald.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister and the Government maintain that they did not seek the prorogation in order to frustrate Parliament talking about Brexit. The Supreme Court ruled 11-0 that that was not true. But the Prime Minister still maintains that the court was wrong. So will he agree to take a public lie detector test?
I don't know whether, Mr. Speaker, you think the honourable gentleman's question is in order. I will answer him nonetheless by pointing out what he should know if he had read the judgment or listened to the judgment, but the court did not impugn the motives of the government at all.
Mike Wood. Mr. Speaker, the main constitutional functions of this House are to choose and sustain a government and to legislate. Yeah. Since this Parliament seems incapable of doing either, isn't the correct constitutional way forward a general election so voters can decide between a Conservative government to deliver on the Brexit referendum or one of the parties opposite to overturn it?
My honourable friend is completely right, and it is quite extraordinary that the so-called party of the people absolutely refuses to trust the people. And I urge them once again, I think there's still time, if they want to go for a no confidence vote, now is the moment.
Meg Hillier.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister believes himself, by all reports, to be a great statesman. This House, in passing the Withdrawal 2 Act, simply changed the parameters of the discussions he needed to have with Europe. It didn't prevent him having those discussions. If he's the great statesman he is, why can he not then be sure that he can come back with a deal? Because all this House has ruled out is no deal. And, Mr. Speaker, he has not answered the question from my honourable friend from Bishop Auckland. No. What negotiations is he having? What has he put on the table for Europe? Because we are now a month or so to go before he needs to come back with that agreement to this House.
I wonder whether she has ever conducted a negotiation in which she has agreed at the outset that the negotiation must, in any event, conclude in favour of the other side. Because if she has, then I think she will understand what her side of the argument tried to do with the surrender, capitulation, humiliation bill, or whatever you want to call it. We won't be bowed, or we won't be daunted by this. We will get on and try to get the best deal possible, nonetheless, as I think the honourable lady is advocating.
Rachel McLean.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What we've seen today in this House, Mr. Speaker, is more than 70 opposition members who have brought us back here supposedly to talk about Brexit and scrutinise it, when we've actually had 3 years to talk about Brexit in this House, and I have not heard a single original point being made by any member opposition. opposite. Has the Prime Minister heard any new argument? And does he think that the people in this country are interested in what's being said by members opposite, or are they interested in what the priorities that he would want to put forward in a Queen's speech?
I thank you so much, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to my honourable friend. I think what the people of this country want to hear is not just that we're going to get Brexit done on October the 31st, which we will, but also that we're going to come forward with a one-nation Conservative agenda to take this whole United Kingdom forward. And that is what we are going to do. And I hope, by the way, that we will have the support. I mean, I've been listening very carefully, watching the expressions on the faces of members opposite very, very carefully. I think there is more support on the benches opposite for a deal than they might currently live. And I hope they will nurture that feeling, because that is the right way forward for our country.
Angela Crawley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The majority of my constituents did not vote for Brexit.
Hear, hear.
Scotland did not vote for Brexit. This government has no mandate in Scotland. This Prime Minister has no mandate in Scotland. The fact is, he has no respect for the Constitution or rule of law. So why should Scotland not vote to leave this union?
I would just remind the honourable lady that more people in Scotland voted for Brexit than voted for the SNP.
Owen Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister has smirked and smeared his way through this statement this evening, dismissing the ruling by the Supreme Court as novel, when we all know, Mr. Speaker, the country knows that it was a damning indictment of this Prime Minister and his abuse of his power to try and gag Parliament. If he had a shred of decency or integrity, he would apologise to this House, to the country, and he would resign. I've no doubt he's going to do none of those things. He's also steadfastly refused to say that he will not do it again and prorogue this House once more. So can I ask him again, will he guarantee that he won't try and pull this stunt again and seek prorogation?
Mr. Speaker, I think the House and the country does need a Queen's speech, and we will be examining the judgment to see exactly how that should be brought forward in this new context. And all I can say is that if he wants to remove me from office, which I think is what he said he wanted to do, then he should encourage his right honourable friend to screw his courage to the sticking place and have a general election.
Jeremy Lefroy.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. May I wish the Prime Minister and his team well in the negotiations as they continue, because I'm convinced that there is a majority in this House, contrary to what some say, for leaving with a good deal. And I believe that he will bring that to this House. However, he will remember a discussion I had with him earlier this year about freedom of speech. And with freedom of speech, on which we both fully agree, comes responsibility. And sometimes that responsibility means not saying what one maybe would like to say. Words like surrender, words like betray, words like treason. However, I would finally just ask him if he remembers the fable of Aesop, both of us being classicists, about the sun and the wind, and who it was that won. It wasn't the wind that won by blowing everybody, by blowing the person because he wrapped the coat further around himself. It was the sun who, by coming out, banished those clouds and made the man take his coat off. And maybe he should be the Sun King and not the King of Wind.
Well, I thank my honourable friend for his. I remind him of the other fable of Aesop, of course, about the man with who had allowed his hair to be plucked. He had black hair and he had white hair, and he allowed two women, I think it was, to pluck out one hair after the other until he was totally bald. And I think that's a parable, a tale that might be of use to the right honourable gentleman opposite, because he cannot make up his mind about whether he's in favour of leave or remain. And the way to take this country forward is to deliver on the wishes of the people. To deliver on the wishes of the people and come out of the EU. And that is the way to dial down all emotion and all anxiety in this country. Now, as for some of the language that he ascribed to me, I don't think I've ever used those words, and I'd be happy if he could clarify that point.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister's political hero, Sir Winston Churchill, when threatened with deselection by Chamberlainites in his Epping constituency in the 1930s, said, "What is the use of Parliament if it is not the place where true statements can be brought before the people?" He understood the role of Parliament, not simply as delegates to this place, but as representatives, as servants of the people, but also as guardians of the national interest. And there are certain pillars upon which our democracy rests: Parliament, the judiciary, the free press, and the pillars of civil society. Does the Prime Minister not understand that in the way that he has conducted himself, whether the unlawful prorogation of this Parliament, the use of his language in the chamber, the way in which he has withdrawn the whips from people behind him who seemingly have more regard for Conservative values than he does, does he not understand that maybe he is the problem and not the solution? And if he really believes in consent, there are two ways to go back to the people. The first way is to honour the law passed by this House, to seek an extension to Article 50, and we will gladly troop through the lobbies behind him. The other is to put a deal or no deal to the people in a confirmatory vote. Both of those ways will unlock the parliamentary deadlock. The only question is whether he has the courage to do it.
Mr. Speaker, to what end? To what end? Why does he want to... I don't understand, Mr. Speaker, why on earth the honourable gentleman, who I normally admire, normally speaks sense, why on earth would he want to stay in the EU beyond October the 31st? What is his purpose? What is his purpose? If he wants... The people have spoken. It would cost another £1 billion a month. I simply fail to understand his logic.
I just want to ask the honourable gentleman, the member for Walsall North, before calling him, whether he can confirm, if he can, that's fine, that he has been here since 6:30 without interruption, without going out of the chamber at any stage. Without interruption. Very good. Mr. Eddie Hughes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I was inspired to get to my feet because of the excitement in the chamber. Mr. Speaker, I wanted to draw attention to the fact that on the 27th of April, as a humble backbencher, the Prime Minister visited my constituency, and just 4 or 5 days later, we won 2 more council seats. However, the Leader of the Opposition recently visited my constituency about 10 days ago, and since then I've got 5 new members of the party. Does the Prime Minister believe that this net effect might explain the hesitance on the part of the Leader of the Opposition to try to call a general election?
I remember well that happy afternoon we spent in J.D. Wetherspoons, as I seem to recall. And I noted the popularity of my honourable friend with his constituents, but I also noted their determination to get Brexit done on October the 31st, and that's what we're going to do. And I hope for the support of the benches opposite.
Lillian Greenwood.
Mr. Speaker, the Supreme Court judgment yesterday began, and I quote, "It is important to emphasise that the issue in these appeals is not when and on what terms the UK leaves the European Union." So, without reference to Brexit, will the Prime Minister now apologise to this House and to the people of this country for giving